Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this August edition of My Story, brought to you by AWS and supported by Plant and Food Research. It's a beautiful sunny day up here in Auckland, so I hope you're all not too freezing. This month we are joined by Erin Maher from Plant and Food Research. She's a business manager. And that's all I'm going to say on the topic because she's going to talk to you about herself for about the next 30 minutes. The chat's open, so if you think of a question, just pop it into the chat and we'll do questions at the end. So take it away, Erin.
Thanks for the introduction, Emma, and thanks everyone for joining today. Apologies if I just have to stop for a little cough or a drink of water like everyone else this time of year. I seem to have been caught out by the lurgy. So when I was asked to do this, of course, I got the classic imposter syndrome that is all too common with us women, just because there's so many amazing, talented women who have done this session before me, with a lot more experience and who I would have considered to have a much more traditional career in science that might resonate a little more strongly with this audience. But I hope you can still manage to take something out of today. So growing up, I was in the mighty Horowhenua on a free-range egg farm. So my childhood was full of cleaning dirty eggs and wheelbarrowing grain up a hill and into the paddocks with 1,000 chickens. And I tell you, the second you walk through the gate with a barrel full of grain, they're all jumping on top of it, trying to get in and making it a lot harder to push it to where it needs to go. So it made for becoming a very strong teenager. So growing up rurally, that's where my love of animals really started. And I had dogs, cats, mice, guinea pigs, sheep, rabbits, you name it, anything that I could get my hands on. And I'll never forget the proud moment of winning an award at the agricultural day at my local country primary school for best in caring and rearing. And essentially what that meant is my little lamb would follow me around anywhere. So there's certain things that you had to do with your animal, and mine would follow me around, no problems, with no lead required. So because of all of this, I do have a point. I had set my eyes on veterinary school. And so I had the high school subjects all planned out and plastered onto my wall from a very young age. The most important, of course, being chemistry, biology, and believe it or not, we had to take physics as well. So I would be the first in my family to attend university. So my brothers and I were pretty curious kids, and I'll never forget the thousands of "but why" questions that we put to my parents on the daily. Why does it rain? Why is there thunder and lightning? What is a cloud? What makes it day and night? We just kept going. And so they very wisely decided to invest in a series of just why science books to keep us kids satisfied. And I think could have been where my interest in science all initially began. I needed an explanation for almost anything, and nice to find out that most of the time there was one, and I had a thirst for learning it all. So the big day came when I entered into the veterinary selection program at Massey University. After the completion of that initial selection process, my dreams were crushed all in a matter of seconds as I was informed I didn't make the selection. And similar to med, it's highly competitive, so don't feel too bad for me. There were plenty of other people in this boat. And we just had a couple of weeks to now decide what our new focus was going to be. And I chose genetics and biochemistry, mixed in with a little bit of human nutrition. And that was based off the advice from one of my favorite lecturers. He said, don't stress out about what you want to be when you grow up, or where this will take you, or what job you'll get. Just follow your nose and study what sounds interesting to you. So that's where I landed and loved it so much. I ended up one day in a lab extracting my own DNA and then taking photos of my chromosomes under the microscope. And I thought that was so cool. I got that printed on my ANZ FPOS card. Most people might choose friends, family, a location, or a pet, and I chose my chromosomes. So the theme of the presentation today, you'll see, is just yeah, following your nose, and that's what I've done ever since. And it means that essentially my career journey has been far from linear. It's a little bit all over the place based on what just caught my interest. And don't read into the curvature too much there. It doesn't indicate that I've had crazy loops and lows and highs, but I think we all have in our career. But the trade-off to having something so non-linear is that I am now really a generalist. So not a deep expert in anything. And I think, you know, if I could go back, this probably would have been a little more of a conscious decision. So jumping into the first job that I got once I graduated, I was working for Biosecurity in New Zealand. And the role here was to essentially take risk assessments that came from another science team within the business and translate those into trade rules, which people would have to comply by to bring in products or animals into the country. So we'd provide advice to New Zealand companies, we'd issue import permits, we'd draft the regulations, which were known as import house standards, and of course start considering dispensations, because there's plenty of instances where people can't meet the exact requirements to the T. And one of those is the photo there on the left. We've got racehorses being brought into the country on a plane. You know, they're worth $250,000 or more each. And it was important that they weren't pumped up with all sorts of vaccinations and have all these blood draws unnecessarily when they're doing the annual racing circuit around the world. So that was one of the portfolios I'd very often have to consider dispensations for. The next photo there is the cute little pygmy marmoset. So the one next to that iguana, we did write the import regulations for zoo animals as well, which was probably the most fun, interesting and exotic part of the job. So, you know, the risk assessment might say that this little pygmy marmoset needs X amount of blood tests over Y amount of days. And we were getting them from the UK government at the time. And they called me and said, look, if we did the amount of blood tests you're asking for, this little creature would probably die. So one of the really big learnings in this job was the delicate balance between assessing that risk, making sure that we're doing what we can to cover our bases and not introduce new diseases into New Zealand, but then also some pragmatic compromises when you're converting those risk assessments into some regulations that everyone can swallow. So there's definitely a bit of tension between those two. And we also had to legally consult internationally. So you can't just write a regulation and put it into force. It has to go out for 60 days worth of consultation, and you have to address all the submitters' concerns. So it takes a really long time to get some of this stuff off the ground. And another big learning in this job was giving people news that they didn't want to hear. So quite often you're telling people no, not yet, or maybe they have to put their pet dog into quarantine for 6 months before it can be let out and are allowed to roam around New Zealand. So disappointing and making a lot of people angry was definitely something I learned how to manage early on in my career. And one thing in this role that I also took on quite early was continuing to ask for more responsibility, more portfolios, different variety. And this brings me back to something that was drilled into me growing up, and I can still hear Dad's voice saying it, that shy people miss out. And he's not wrong in that. You know, the more you put yourself out there and ask for things, I mean, people can say no, sure, but sometimes you'll never get those opportunities if you don't. So continually being annoying to my boss there, asking for more. So the next role, or sorry, experience was being selected to go on an agricultural exchange to Japan. So this was funded by the Japanese government, and they flew a group of New Zealand professionals in the agri space over to Japan for a couple of weeks to visit, for example, dairy processing factories or rice paddy fields, and get an understanding of the major things that were produced in Japan and how that was done. And this was one of my first forays out of New Zealand, other than Australia and Thailand. And I would say this is where my love of travel, different countries and cultures all began. And I really ended up with a bit of a thirst for this, which changed the trajectory of my career quite early on. So I went, when I came home, I joined the Japan New Zealand Business Council. There was a small group of us that established the youth executive. The council was very traditional, and we were hoping to inject some fresh young energy into it and some different thinking, just to make sure there was a bit of a succession plan in terms of the bilateral relationships between New Zealand and Japan. And I'll never forget being at an event, and a Japanese businessman said to me, "Oh, you are so strong and very strong-willed, and you have very strong opinions." And I said to him, "Oh, thank you. Really appreciate you saying that." And he was quite taken aback and said, "Is that a compliment?" Oh, okay. So it was the first time it really dawned on me that things can be perceived so differently across cultures, and the fact that I was opinionated and strong-willed wasn't necessarily seen as a good thing by this person. But this led me to go on and study international business while I was working at Victoria University, to plug some gaps that I felt like I currently had and where I wanted to go. And I can tell you, international business is a hell of a lot easier than trying to study science. Much, much crazier ride. So from there, I moved into a trade policy role. So still at the Ministry for Primary Industries, as it is now known. And this role was about analysing different countries' trade policies. So it could be their import or export taxes, their inspections or border regulations, understanding how they prop up their domestic farming industry through subsidies, and also free trade agreement negotiations. So I was lucky enough to be sent to the World Trade Organization to represent New Zealand there in Geneva, to the OECD in Paris, and then I was also involved with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiation. So that was all of the ASEAN countries and their free trade agreement partners. So we also had Japan, Korea, India, New Zealand, and Australia in the room. And you can imagine just what getting 16 countries to agree to certain things all together looked like. It was pretty drawn out, pretty messy, and sometimes you'd spend 4 or 5 hours just on one paragraph of a free trade agreement. And that doesn't include the legal scrub and getting it perfect. That was just landing on the wording and the intention of the particular paragraph that we're negotiating. So what I learned in this role was definitely stamina. Countries will employ different tactics to put you on the back foot. They might make the room really hot, really cold. They might not provide any water or food. So sometimes we were negotiating till 10, 11 o'clock at night. And I do have a fantastic photo of New Zealand's head negotiator and our team lead eating a giant block of chocolate. I think it was a Cadbury's plain dairy milk, because that was all he could get that day for dinner, because we were just so far away from anything else in the venue that we were at. So I certainly learned to push through under sometimes some trying conditions. And I also saw just how unfair the competition can be in these negotiations with much bigger powers than New Zealand. So we're left with a bit of limited negotiating mandate as a small market. So people aren't that interested in New Zealand and exporting their goods here. It's not where they're going to make the most money. And also the open and fair regulatory settings that New Zealand has. So we're one of the only countries in the world that doesn't provide subsidies to its farmers. We run an open market system, prices dictated by the open markets. And, you've got countries like Japan where 50% of a farmer's income comes from government subsidies, or Canada where you can't produce milk on a dairy farm unless you've actually got a quota certificate to say you can produce that and exactly how much as well. So all of these countries have really high import tariffs, sorry, on the products that New Zealand ships overseas because they need to support their domestic industries. If they're shelling out all these subsidies, they can't have countries exporting their goods at a highly competitive environment at a competitive price, overriding their entire system. So it made it really, really difficult for us because we don't have hardly any tariffs on the products that get imported into New Zealand. So we had very little leverage in that space and had to get quite creative with our arguments. I did get pretty worn out traveling around a lot and decided in my next role I just wanted to stay in one space. So I ended up taking a role at the New Zealand Embassy in Beijing. And again, this is with the Ministry for Primary Industries. So I was representing New Zealand's agricultural interests, but we were seconded into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and fully part of that diplomatic system. So the role in China was to negotiate access for new products that New Zealand wanted to export to China, but didn't have the rules for yet and didn't have the access. But what we actually spent about 70 or 80% of our time on was maintaining the access for products we already had, like apples, like kiwi fruit. It was a highly politically charged environment that wasn't always based on science. So actions that New Zealand was taking completely outside of this context, maybe in the UN or public statements it was making, all impacted on trade and how the likes of, like, for example, Fonterra or Zespri found their products getting through the border the following day. So that definitely added an extra layer of complication to what we were doing. We also had to make sure that all the factories from New Zealand that wanted to export were listed. If you weren't listed, your premise wasn't approved, you couldn't be sending product that was manufactured in that facility. And also providing advice to exporters before they sent product, dealing with consignments that were held at the border who got stuck in helping to clear those, and then of course representing New Zealand at the different trade shows around China. And to do this role, we did have to go through a security clearance process and be vetted and make sure that our backgrounds were all kosher with what they needed us to do. So that was an interesting experience as well. And the cultural context was probably the biggest learning from this role, getting really comfortable with the uncomfortable, knowing that you can't control everything and things could get wildly out of control pretty quickly and you had to just roll with it. So being really adaptable, creative, constantly trying to think of new solutions, or just being really persistent and not giving up on something. The other thing that was quite interesting is New Zealand, in terms of its regulatory settings, has moved from what can be known as quite a prescriptive environment to one that's really outcome based these days. So ultimately, we need you to achieve X, but how you do that is up to you and your individual settings. Whereas a lot of other countries around the world, and in the case of China, still operate a very prescriptive environment. They want certain T's to be dotted and I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed. So trying to match up the way that New Zealand runs things and its programs over here with what China needed to see from us in terms of an equivalent status was always a delicate balance. The other thing that was quite interesting is negotiating with your own side. So when you're fully immersed in that cultural context and you see what works and what doesn't, what lands and what doesn't, you start to get a feel for how you should approach things. And if you are in Wellington, you don't always have that context, and you might think a particular action is a good one to take. So that negotiating with your own side in terms of what we're being instructed to do or deliver from Wellington and what will actually get the job done on the China side was an interesting one. And certainly when I moved into my next role, that was something that I encouraged a lot of New Zealand businesses to think about when they, at great expense, hired people within country, within market, to really listen to what those people were saying and the advice that they were giving. So that's a good segue into the next role, was with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. So this role didn't exist. It was essentially made up for me based on a need that I saw between the regulatory environment and the business environment and the different language being used, the different KPIs and drivers. So essentially, I was brought in to help bridge that gap between just that purely commercial perspective and that regulatory perspective. And I was set up to essentially help speak a language that businesses could understand. There's lots of acronyms in the regulatory space. So advising companies on what that looked like, maybe product registration requirements during their early stage market selection and planning, and also navigating those regulatory affairs for existing exporters that were getting stuck or held up on something. Within about 5 or 6 months, I was asked to come on to New Zealand Trade and Enterprise on a more permanent basis as an account manager. So I looked after a portfolio of New Zealand companies in the food and beverage space, supporting them with whatever they needed along their export journey, whether that be market research, regulations, consumer insights, maybe selecting where they might sell their products and who the distribution partner could be for them. Some of the learnings that came out of that role was really the importance of communicating things to people who aren't deep in the detail of what it is that we do. So in the case of regulation, it could be someone's bread and butter and something they're immersed in every day, but say the CEO or the marketing manager has no or very little exposure to regulations. Being able to bridge that gap and explain things in a way that makes sense to your audience. And I think that definitely applies to science communication, where we might be talking to someone across a discipline, or maybe someone who doesn't have a technical background, but speaking or explaining to them what we're trying to get across in a language that they understand. And also just taking the time to explain the why. So the context behind something, and not just necessarily a decision like this will take 6 months or the answer is no, but providing a bit more color behind reasons for doing things. Another thing that really came across quite strongly in this role was understanding your customer. So who is buying this product or the service that you're offering? Who are you speaking to, and what are they interested in? So what might sell a product or service here in New Zealand really well sometimes can land really badly when you copy and paste it into another market. So understanding what those individual drivers are for who you're targeting was a really important part of localizing the value proposition of what it was you were presenting in that different country. I also saw a lot more success when people were focused and targeted. So a lot of New Zealand companies were, they only had so much resource and so much time to give. It was very easy to spread themselves too thin. So really having their eyes on the prize and really honing in on what it is they needed to do to make that a success. I would say the biggest thing to date I've taken away from this role is the real empathy for New Zealand companies out there doing it. It's really not easy. It's hard enough to run a business in New Zealand, let alone then try and export. And, they're doing what they can and running into all sorts of issues every day and something new coming at them. So real empathy for getting on and doing it and making a success. It's very complex. And lastly, in this role, I learned that if I hadn't quite convinced someone of something, then I would get other voices in front of that person to iterate that same message. So if I was trying to tell a New Zealand business something that I'd seen happen elsewhere and suggest maybe they should try something different, they weren't quite convinced straight away, I might bring in another business who's done the same thing to reiterate that message. I might bring in one of our business development managers in the market they're targeting, or one of their private sector advisors to again reiterate that same message and in a different way, perhaps from a different angle, and using their own stories. And keep trying till it was communicated in a way that really resonated with the person that I was talking to. And that certainly held me in good stead for my next role as well. So that was at a group called G2G, or Government to Government, whereby the role was essentially to work alongside New Zealand science organisations to clearly define what it is that we might have to sell in terms of products or services, all within the realms of sustainable food systems, which was incredibly broad, but trying to land on things that could be of interest to other countries. So that could include packaging up solutions as a nice little package and selling them into foreign governments or multilateral funding agencies. And they could be sold as training that we might offer, consulting, workshops, research on a fee-for-service base, providing policy advice to governments, or framework development. So a couple of examples of this would include in the UAE, where water is incredibly scarce and they're producing date palms as one of their big crops. Understanding exactly how much water a date palm uses, and then ultimately that allowed the government to regulate how much water would be growers would be allowed to use for irrigation. Another example was supporting the regional government of India with their long-term goal of wanting to take their wool industry and essentially completely convert it into more of a sheep meat industry. So entirely different focus on the breed of sheep and the way you farm. So that was certainly an interesting one. It is ongoing, that project, as I understand it. And then lastly, in Mongolia, another example, they had a foot and mouth disease outbreak and lost access for being able to export their products into China, which was one of their biggest markets, and their economy relied on it. So creating some standards and frameworks to allow the government to show they had compartmentalized the disease only in one particular area of the country and allow exports to continue from other areas of the country. So it was those types of things that I would do in this role. And it was certainly challenging when you had the first call with a foreign government and they wanted everything. They started very big and wide, and we had to then narrow that down through a course of conversations over a few hours to one very discrete, specific project with a specific scope. And what was really interesting in this role was just how New Zealand is perceived in all these markets that we went into in terms of our reputation in the agricultural space. So it certainly got us in through the front door, and people never said no to wanting to meet with us. But what was the challenge was being appropriately prepared to then walk through that door and deliver to this country what we promised or what they needed. And certainly understanding the funding cycles and mechanisms was pretty key. And of course, that's no different to applying for grants for science in New Zealand or offshore. So understanding the financial years of these governments, the deadlines we had to meet, the scope of the budget, how much money we'll be dealing with, who the decision makers were, and what their motivations or drivers might be. And just making sure you are speaking with the decision maker and not a lower level official, but still getting intel at that working level to really understand what's going on behind the scenes. And you always need one insider champion to get things across the line. And I think this applies really broadly to a lot of situations in New Zealand as well. And then in terms of the science, it was always a compromise between meeting this customer where they were at with a solution that worked for them and that they were happy with, and not being perfect or taking a purist approach on how we might approach this problem in a scientific context or in a New Zealand context. So a bit of tension there with trying to land on something that worked for everyone. And then the same as before in the previous role I mentioned, repeating those key messages until they resonate with the client to get them thinking a little more the way you want them to. And we definitely used visits of foreign governments into New Zealand and putting them in front of multiple experts to get those messages across. And that's just a picture of me in my kit to head over to Saudi Arabia by myself, which was a little bit intimidating, but I did get to spend quite a bit of time in the Middle East with this role. And then lastly, I've landed myself at Plant and Food Research, which I'm very grateful for, a great place to work. And as a business manager, I act as a conduit between the customers that we do fee for science work for and our science teams who are actually doing the hard yards, the work. And we also support the commercialization of new technologies that are developed in-house here at Plant and Food, and provide a bit of a business or commercial lens over projects to ensure that ultimately we might end up with getting some impact in these. And this has also led me to taking part in this year's Onboard program, which is a startup governance training program over a 12-month period. So you go through a few formal modules like finance, capital raising, impactful communication, understanding what it looks and feels like to be a director on a deep tech startup in New Zealand. And alongside that, being able to be an observer on a real life board, a real life startup for a 12-month period. So I've been doing that with Hotline Labs, which is a very interesting company. So just to round it out before we start the Q&A, I would just say that New Zealand is so small and everyone's connected. I quite often reach out to people and ask them for a coffee. Most of the roles that I've talked about today, I met the hiring manager well before anything was advertised, just to understand what the role involved and signal that I'd be interested. And I try and meet with one new person a month, hear about their career. I've discovered there's very few people out there, from the age of 20 right through to 70 who don't know what they want to be when they grow up, but it's never too late to figure out what that is or what the next step is, and just the importance of relationships. And I've only ever been rejected from a coffee request once, and that was from a woman, actually, very senior in governance. But I think there's quite a few unique things about what a science background teaches you that the world needs, not always in traditional science careers. That critical thinking, that patience, that rigor, the ongoing communication with lots of different people. I think it positions people really strongly to go forth and conquer. So I'll just round out with that. Thanks, Emma.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I feel like we've been around the world about 5 times during that talk. So it's amazing where a genetics degree can take you.
Yeah, I
So
never would have guessed.
yeah. So the chat is open. So if you have a question, just pop it in the chat and Erin can answer those questions. I think everyone's starstruck right now. Too much whirling around their heads. But what was I'll ask a question while everyone else is thinking. What was the most interesting place that you worked around the planet in terms of place rather than company?
Oh,
You've
I
been a
mean,
few different places, so
yeah. I think Saudi had to have been one of the more interesting places. It was just so different from New Zealand. It's a desert, and the New Zealand representatives that work overseas all live in a compound with huge brick walls around it, and they drive in through the gate every morning and have to stop and be inspected for bombs to make sure no one's going to blow up the car or as it sort of drives through. And I think this social uniform I found really interesting. So all the men are in white and all the women are in black, and everyone wears the same thing. You go out to the malls, to dinner. Yeah, just a very, very different way of living, and not a whole lot of access to the beautiful green landscapes that we have here. So,
yeah, it's the opposite side of the coin, I guess.
mm,
So we've got some questions coming in. So, it sounds like a lot of influencing with authority. Have you got any tips on that?
mm. I think if you're able to, doing a bit of a map. So, starting from the top, what is the position and the title? Or even you can start at the bottom, maybe the direct person you're working with. Who is their boss? Who is their boss? Who is their boss? Who makes the decision? And who adjacent to that does this person respect or listen to? And trying to come up with a bit of a map of who's who in the system that can get your message across. Um, and I would say don't be afraid to be direct. Ask direct questions and get the answer that you really want. And I think we have the benefit of being able to do that in New Zealand a lot more than other cultures. Um, so I think trying to do that certainly helps.
So the backup question to that is how is that not going over someone's head? So I guess how do you do it in a way that's taken as positively rather than like you're just trying to skip layers?
Yeah, I think it was a lot easier outside of New Zealand working with really high context, hierarchical cultures, because every year there would be a visit from the Prime Minister to China, as an example, or the Minister, or the CEO of MPI, or one of the businesses that we were working with. So you can be having a discussion at the working level, and then you can be talking to the minister and saying, these are the messages I need you at your level to deliver. So you could use other people to do that work for you, particularly because you're not always in a position, particularly in a hierarchical situation, to talk to that level yourself. You may only be working at that working level. So who else might you be able to use in that system to deliver what you need?
Okay. Okay, slightly different question. You mentioned New Zealand's reputation in agriculture. How are we seen from the outside, and does it match what you see?
Mm. Um, I think that some countries, yeah, we're seen as the gold standard and that we have expertise. So, for example, in India, I did projects on apples and with sheep. We've got the most productive apple industry in New Zealand. We removed subsidies for our sheep meat industry back in the 80s, so have a fully open market. And we're able to produce more kilograms of meat per carcass again than any other country in the world. And we've brought down the numbers of sheep that we have and brought up the level of meat. So, whereby we had past experiences that we could illustrate our expertise in, it was an easy sell. When I went into the Middle East thinking we were pretty fabulous there too and expecting a warm reception, that's where I was really struck with the Dutch, the Israelis, the Australians who were over there in force, right at diplomatic levels, CEO levels. Their government or businesses were investing so much more in the region and had deeper partnerships. And I think that we got lost in the sea of huge competition. So I guess it depended on the market and what it was that we were trying to target. So it's not always rosy. I would definitely say that in terms of how we're received and our reputation.
Hmm. Any other questions? I think the winter has got to people's questioning brains.
Understandably.
It's very cold at the moment.
We're not allowed to say that in Auckland, Emma.
It's cold by Auckland standards. Even for a Brit, it's cold by Auckland standards. Okay, I'll give it another minute.
There's always LinkedIn if anyone else thinks of something and wants to reach out. Happy to answer questions that way.
I've got a probably a bit more personal question. Um, with a role that takes you all around the world and things like that, how do you get work-life balance? How do you keep being Erin and all of the
I,
things that
I'm
Erin likes?
I'm the worst example of that. Um, that is something that I continuously have to focus and work on. When I came back from China, I actually had to take 3 months off, completely burnt out, sleeping 16 hours a day. I left New Zealand being able to run a half marathon and came back struggling to walk 1 kilometer. I was really broken. So I think I learned a lot from that experience about what not to do. Everyone knows what they should be doing, and finding the time and space to do that is difficult, but it's no different to business strategy and knowing what to say no to actually. And yeah, that's again something that is certainly a work on for me. Can't be all things to everyone.
Yeah, I imagine it's quite hard when you're overseas and presumably in quite a small group of people that you see every day, and obviously none of your family and friends and things are there. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I
And you're
can.
traveling on your weekends quite often, and technically time and lieu is a thing in your contract, but in practice, it's another story. So yeah.
You think that's true? Did you see the same happening to the boys in your team?
Yeah, interesting.
Or do you think you were trying to be a bit of an overachiever? You talked about imposter syndrome right at the beginning of the talk, so
I
It's
would
always
say
interesting
that,
to me about how girls
yeah,
and girls and boys manage their time differently.
I was certainly surrounded by overachievers. So I definitely wasn't unique in that sense, but a lot of the guys that I worked with had families, and I think that can really change your perspective on what's important. And actually, no, I have to go home. There's someone else that needs me, and allows you to draw firmer boundaries that are actually more accepted um, by management or society. So um, there was only one guy I worked with that didn't have family. He got burnt out and ended up leaving as well. So um, I think the difference was life stage more than it was gender. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. There's no more questions in the chat. So, um, thank you very much for that talk. It was really interesting. A very, very different career journey. Um, and thank you to everybody who's here and watching. And thank you to Plant and Food Research for supporting our series. We'll have another My Story in September. I just need to finish off organizing what that will be. So keep an eye on our website, our Facebook, and our LinkedIn. And you'll get the details come through there. So there's lots of people saying great stuff and thanks for a great talk in the chat. So thank you all very much, and we will see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.